I'd like to welcome everyone here today. And I'd like to say, first off, that I'm really glad to be a part of this team. It's been a really fun last 4 to 5 years working with this group of folks. And I don't see that my co-author is here today, but I'd first like to introduce myself a little bit more. I provided Ryan with a little bit of information about myself, and he didn't share all of it.
You're lucky.
I'm an ecologist with the USDA ARS in Logan, Utah. We happen to be on campus at Utah State University, and that's why I worked with Chris Call, who's my co-author. Chris and I have been a very good team to work together the last 4 to 5 years, and in this process, we've really seen good opportunities to apply ecology in the field. So, first of all, I'd like to start off. You know, what really attracted me to the area-wide project in EVIPM is that it really illustrated that there is quite a bit of common ground between science and management. You know, oftentimes we'll see research occurring over here and management occurring over here, and we all notice that there's a big chasm there, and our goal is to bring it all together. EVIPM is a way for people to do that. And if I'd like to just illustrate really quickly, because I think it's going to be important as I go throughout my talk today, to understand what I believe are some of the key elements of common ground between science and management. First of all, ecosystems change. Okay? One site could have gone through a lot of different things. In the past, it may have been heavily grazed for a long time. It might have been used as a temporary cropland. Restoration may have happened on that piece of land years and years ago. And then we come on board here, and here we are in the 2000s, and we want to change it again. So ecosystems change, and it will always occur, and there are different states. One site could look a lot of different ways. If it wasn't that way, we would probably want to just walk away from this right now. So we're a very optimistic group of people here. We believe that change occurs and that we can influence it. So, as we know, humans can influence change. We've seen from the past. And we want to understand what's going on within an ecosystem. What's the ecology of the system? What are the processes that are occurring so that we can drive these changes and be more responsible? Third, we've come a long way since the 1930s when the term ecosystem was coined. So this is a relatively new science. And if we're going to go ahead into the future, EVIPM gives us an opportunity to pull together these principles and really understand how to use science to solve some problems. Okay, first of all, Tony kind of put the model together, and I'm going to just make sure we're at the right spot here. First of all, we need to recognize that there's a problem. Okay? We know our sites. We see that there's a weed problem there. We know that there's a historical component of it, and we feel like we can change it. We have to know our site very well. If we don't, we're just going to be fiddling around and wasting money. We need to understand that there are a lot of good principles that are starting to emerge and good understanding of how humans can change ecosystems. And throughout today, you're going to be hearing about them. I'm going to be focusing on some of the primary causes of change that are illustrated here in the blue. But what I'm going to try to do is try to emphasize throughout my talk here today that ecological processes are what's driving changes. And if we can, with our management, find a way to understand ecological processes and start to modify them effectively with our management, then we can start seeing change. So this is what I'm going to do today. First of all, I'm just going to kind of walk you through what are some of the ecological processes that are in need of repair. I think that'll set the stage for us today, because you're going to see lots of different presentations where people are going to build on this concept. Second, I'm going to show you what we've been doing in the last 4 to 5 years out in Park Valley, Utah, as one of our demonstration sites was established there in 2009, and we've actually learned quite a bit working together with our partners. So I'm going to show you how we apply the EBIPM within this community. So let's just first start off. The core of ecology is this concept of the ecosystem, okay? And ecosystems is a concept, and that is we try to understand the connections between the abiotic component and the biotic component. Seems pretty easy, right? We all understand this concept. It's been around a long time. Probably learned it in the 7th grade. But the challenge is that there's a lot of different processes that are occurring at the same time and at lots of different scales. Some of them are occurring quickly, some of them are very slow, some of them are occurring only in certain spaces, some of them only can be observed in small spaces, and some of them can only be observed in very broad spaces. So each of us has expertise in something, some understanding of ecological processes, and we all try to piece that together to understand how the system operates. So then there's going to be feedbacks. You affect one component, like the biotic component, you're going to impact the abiotic component. The idea here is that there's feedbacks going on. Okay, I just thought it'd be a kind of an interesting exercise to ask the question, what processes have been studied? And I'm going to give you an example from the literature. So since the 1930s and 40s, papers in science started to be published on cheatgrass. And what I did is I tried to find every single paper that's ever been published that actually contains data. And I put it together into a histogram. And here are what those data look like. For instance, with over 500 articles that have been published on this subject, most of them deal with reproduction. And then a steady increase as you go from dispersal to emergence, interference, resource availability, and disturbance. So, some of these processes I'm going to talk about in much more detail today. But I just wanted to throw this up here, that people are studying these processes, and we're beginning to understand them quite well. That's good, because EBIPM is a way to bring them all together and to think about them before we actually act on the land. Okay, just to put us into context of where we are with this model. If you're at this stage, you know a lot about your site. You've already done your site assessment. You understand that ecosystems change, and you're beginning to understand some of the processes that are involved in that. So what I've highlighted here today on the far right are 3 of the primary processes involved in modifying your site availability, your species availability, and your species performance. Because these are components of the model you're going to learn a lot about today. I'm kind of picking the lower hanging fruit of what's going on with our ecological processes within damaged ecosystems. And I'm going to illustrate each one of these for you really quickly. First of all, disturbance. We all know that disturbance is normal. It happens in all ecosystems, from small to large. Oftentimes you will see that as the size and the intensity of disturbances change, we start to see degradation within a system, and the ecosystem state may change. So disturbance is a driving factor, and I think we all recognize that. So as a key process, we need to be well aware of how it's going to change our ecosystems. And the way it starts to change our ecosystems is the way it acts upon species differently. Let's take an example here from the far left. And let's go to the top of the graph there. As disturbance frequency increases, it tends to be a selective force upon species diversity. For instance, you're going to see species that are long-lived or that have real slow growth rates start to diminish from the ecosystem because they just can't reproduce fast enough. With intermediate disturbances, which are quite common in stable ecosystems, you might see diversity stabilizing at an intermediate rate. Well, let's take an example from annual grass systems, which is the focus of this forum today. As the disturbance frequency starts to increase, you're going to see species that have fast growth rates, and they can reproduce quickly, and over winter, in the seed, start to dominate. This isn't rocket science, it's range science. So, as a selective force, we need to understand that disturbance is something that we need to get a good handle on. But what happens when we start seeing species turnover, that is plant species turnover and wildlife species turnover, you start to build a whole different ecosystem. And this is just an example from digging a pit. If you go out there and dig a pit, you're going to start to see that if you, in a very diverse ecosystem where you have shrubs and forbs and grasses in the ecosystem, you're going to see that they have very different types of inputs and their influence is deeper within the soil. So this is just an example of how that ecosystem operates. Once an invasion might occur, you might start to see that the consequences of having different species are that they're shorter lived, like in this case cheatgrass here on the right. They have fewer inputs deep into the soil. Their phenology, that is how long that they're actively photosynthesizing, is shorter than the native community that has been replaced. So you start to see that with disturbance changes, you start to see species turnovers and replacement by annual species. And once the ecosystem starts to change, we're starting to see changes in processes. Let's just give an example from a former student at Utah State University in Booth in 2003. She found that some of the consequences of seeing species turnover, shown in this graph here, are that the extractable amounts of ammonium and nitrate starts to shift within this ecosystem. In a typical intact sagebrush ecosystem, for instance, you might see pretty even uptake of resources throughout the year, but once it's been invaded, you start to see, as shown here in red, that there's a pool of nitrogen that becomes available and sits there throughout fall. And as we know, that can be bad if you have only annuals within the system. They're going to use it as a pool. They're going to use that nitrogen pool to reestablish the site. So you start to see how resources being changed within an ecosystem is a very important component here, because it provides a feedback where the annuals can reestablish in a heavily enriched environment. So what I've tried to illustrate really quickly here are that when you have disturbance changes and when you have species turnovers and function changes, feedbacks start to come into play here that makes this state resilient. So it's no wonder why these are so hard for us to change. It's because they're resilient. They stay in this condition, they come right back to it, and we need to find ways to modify processes correctly so that we can start changing the resilience. So what I've tried to illustrate here for you today is that disturbance and species changes and function change starts to change the ecosystem and degrade it. So restoration starts to become an uphill battle. We know that we, for instance, in the graph here on the right, in the upper right, we need to have species doing things and we need to bring functions back if we want to restore them. So I've completed the first part of my talk, and that is to identify some of the processes that are in need of repair. And that's the essential step here of EBIPM, really understanding those processes. So I'm going to move on and talk about how we've tried to apply the EBIPM model within Utah. First of all, Park Valley, Utah is in the Eastern Great Basin, shown here with the red star. And we chose a research site very carefully. We actually, Chris and I and many of our partners, looked many places throughout Utah, and we found a community of people who were very interested in adopting the EBIPM program. This ecosystem has gone through a lot of change in the past. In fact, this site that I'm standing on right here is a particular ecological site of interest to us. You'll see here that historically sites like this are primarily dominated by shrubs. In this particular example here, this site has been dry farmed in the past, and Leslie Morris will be talking about that a little bit later. But first of all, these sites don't have a lot of annual grasses in them, and they shouldn't. But what happened is in the early 80s, with some unusual high precipitation events, these systems started to change. Now these are salt desert ecosystems throughout the basins and ranges of Utah. And once we started seeing fires driven by cheatgrass abundance, we started losing our shrub component, and then repeat that for the last 30 years. And you get into a situation that was very typical of our demonstration area that we decided to start working in with some landowners. So this is pretty much what a good portion of our demonstration area looked like when we started to scout it out with our landowners and the resource managers of this area. So we decided to sit down together, all of us, and we wanted to talk about what we wanted. And across the board, everyone recognized that we needed to change this ecosystem to a perennial dominated system, as shown here on the right. But we needed to do a lot. In order to adopt the EBIPM framework, we realized that we're not going to be doing small plow research anymore. A lot of us have already done that. We've already worked on little meters, and we've been able to spray the herbicide so well that the weed's gone. Success, right? It's a little bit more difficult when you want to work at operational scales. And EBIPM gave us an opportunity to pull together and come up with some strategies that are ecologically based, trying to affect some processes. I'll just give you an example. This is how we often think, right? You get to know your site really well. You scout it out for a year. You spend a lot of time walking through it, and you start to understand what the problems are. You see the spatial extent of the problem. You understand a little bit about the history. When was the last fire? Where are we at in the cheatgrass cycle? And we realized that we were primarily in this state right here. This is not the exact ecological site that we worked in, but this one is quite similar in Utah. We realized we were in the invasive annual grass state, and we wanted to get out of it. To our knowledge, very few people have gone back up to the current potential state. Working with this crew, we decided to go down to the seeded range state, just so you understand what our goal was. We wanted to meet the needs of people who owned the land, and we chose to go to a seeded range state, which we've had a lot more success doing. So just to kind of recap, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that we thought about these processes quite a bit. Disturbance. And we identified the species were just not present there anymore. In fact, they weren't reproducing at all on the site. And we knew the resource acquisition was going to be quite important here if we were going to give our seeding a chance. So first of all, when we talk about site availability, you're going to hear a little bit more about it today, but I want you to really kind of get it in your mind what it really is. Disturbance changes your site. For instance, here on the left, you see this is just a cow footprint. What do you see in that footprint? A lot of seedlings, right? Happens to be cheatgrass. And then on here on the right, you'll see an area that may have burned recently. You see that the litter has been removed. So we're talking about changing the sites that are available for emerging seeds. So whenever you see this word site availability come up later on, you're going to have a picture in your mind. Species availability. Sometimes you're going to have a lot of seed and sometimes you're not going to have hardly any native seed. So you're going to have to modify the species availability. This diagram here on the right shows that on our surfaces out of that site, there was a lot of cheatgrass seed on the ground. Species availability is doing pretty good for cheatgrass. Other seed bank analysis that we did, we realized that we were pretty much out of native seed. There wasn't much out there anymore. So this picture should sit in your mind as you go throughout today, what species availability is. And last of all, when we're talking about species performance, we want to modify the performance of the weed with our techniques. Because if we can reduce the weed enough, then we can start seeing positive responses within the resources in the soil, which then become available for the species that you want on the landscape. Remember that simple feedback? You modify the environment, you change things for your plants. If you change the plants, you might change the environment. See? There's feedbacks. We wanted to get in there and change those feedbacks. So let's just talk about this demonstration area in a little bit more detail, because you have to think about it in terms of time. Okay? In 2007, probably throughout most of the West, we had some pretty amazing dry temperatures, and we had some pretty big fires. Out at our research sites, we didn't see a fire. But this is what it looked like in 2008. We were charged with going out and finding a demonstration area dominated by cheatgrass. I went out and drove around a lot. And what I saw throughout the region was not a lot of cheatgrass. We've all seen this, right? It's like cheatgrass has high years and low years. We chose a low year, so we were already trying to find areas that were going to be good for us to study this problem. But fear not, cheatgrass always comes back. And so we chose some good sites that actually looked like this when we started treating them. So we chose good ones because we expected cheatgrass to come back. I'm just going to show you really briefly some of the treatments that we were thinking about. We knew that there was going to be abundant fuel, so we decided to first put in a prescribed fire in November of 2009 because we wanted to modify site availability. We wanted to remove the litter, which cheatgrass actually germinates much better in. And we wanted to modify species availability. We wanted to remove as much of that cheatgrass seed as we could. It was a late burn though. It's hard to burn. When you try to burn a big patch of cheatgrass and it's up to your waist, you get a lot of people concerned. So we had to wait until late fall to burn. But we still had a pretty good burn. Right after we burned, we contracted with someone to fly on some herbicide. And we chose Plateau because it has a residual effect within the soil to, once again, alter the performance of the cheatgrass seed that we expected to come back. And once again, this was a late application because of when the fire occurred. So we decided to follow that up in late fall. Now keep in mind here, we're not treating plots. We're working with landowners and we're treating basically huge pastures. So when I show you results later on, you got to think of it in terms of we're applying these treatments at large scales, which are typical of what our land managers are using. And these techniques right here were the techniques that the landowners probably would have used. We're just trying to apply it within the ecologically based program here. So we did a seeding in late fall, in fact December, and we were trying to input important seeds back into the ecosystem. And here's our species mix here. And we didn't just pull these out of a hat. We understand the site. In fact, we had studied the site extensively in 2008 to understand what types of species do well in this area. Let me just give you an example. Part of our site assessment that we began in 2008, even though we couldn't really apply our treatments quite yet, we put in a trial to understand how some of the plant materials that my lab have developed to see how they perform out of this particular ecological site. In fact, we were right across the road on the same landowner's land, and we found that over here in the upper right, you'll see that those are all perennial grasses. We have Bezoyski 2, and then we have another species, crested wheatgrass, 2 of them there, and then a baobab. We actually wanted to get an understanding of how these plants performed out there and how they might impact cheatgrass. And this was promising because then we actually came to the conclusion that we can probably count on getting about 5 to 7 seedlings of perennial grasses per meter squared. That's pretty good. That's a good seed being planted to start turning around these processes that we were talking about earlier. Let's talk about time again. Everyone knows that cheatgrass cycles, right? We went out there in 2008 and we couldn't find any, right? It was about 2 to 3% cover. Now what I'm showing you here is a graph of what happened to cheatgrass across our demonstration areas. In 2009, it went up to about 5% cover. It started to recover. This is without even being treated. This is just background noise in our system. We all like to work in laboratories, right? Where things are always constant. Try working in this laboratory, right? I mean, this is difficult. Then it went up to about 10% in 2010, and then by 2011, we're seeing greater than 60% cover of cheatgrass. So this was our backdrop to work in. So we knew that we were going to have some challenges. What I'm going to move on to here is just to give you an idea, but I wanted you to keep this graph in mind here. In fact, it's shown right here on the left. I showed you that we used herbicides and we used fire. And the first thing you'll notice is that in the no-burn situation here, by 2011, just the application of herbicide had reduced cheatgrass cover by about 10%. So it is having an impact. However, when you combine burning and fire, as shown here on the right, that's really when you start seeing a lasting impact. Where we knew we started around 65%, we had reduced it down to about 30% if you look at that far bar over there. We view that as quite successful, because it really is basically knocking cheatgrass back halfway. And, you know, without doing anything, this is not a good scenario. We wouldn't want to leave land in this condition because it's just going to cycle back again. Let me give you an example of what it did to one of the important processes of nutrient dynamics within the site. Now, this is just a kind of a snapshot in time over a 60-day period. In the early spring of each of these years, you'll see that as cheatgrass increased between 9, 10, and 11, just across the board, you're going to see that nitrogen started to drop in these sites. That's because cheatgrass is using it. But with the, as I'm showing here in this example, with just burning alone, we saw an increase in resources in this bar here. So by impacting the plant and changing the disturbance regime, we're impacting another process of resource availability. And hopefully that will be a positive event. Oftentimes, if you don't put anything back into the ecosystem, you might just get annuals coming right back, right? After fire, more nitrogen, more weeds, right? But we inserted some plant materials to change the scenario. And I'll just give you an example of that. The perennial grass response was actually quite nice. I've shown all 8 treatments here to give you an example. Remember that burning an herbicide was generally effective at reducing cheatgrass. Where we reduced the cheatgrass, we saw positive responses, as shown in these 2 bars here. This perennial grass that was seeded started to increase. And the other high point here is that if you look at how many plants you need to establish per meter square, a number of these treatments was quite effective at getting something out there. Instead of just cheatgrass, some of our treatments in just the first year was establishing about 15 plants per meter square. Now imagine that. You've got a small perennial grass seedling that you know is pretty competitive with cheatgrass. Just put 15 of those in a meter square area, you're going to start turning the site over. And these are some of the observations that the land managers and the landowner had seen over time. So we view this demonstration scale research as quite successful. And hopefully in the near future we'll be able to fully understand the implications of 2011, but I can give you just a quick teaser. Things continue to improve in 2011. We just haven't analyzed the data entirely. So, in conclusion today, oftentimes we just need to think about it in simple terms. Invasive annual grasses are basically driving processes within ecosystems, right? And these are the ecosystems that we're interested in changing. We have to think about them. We have to think about how we are going to be applying the right tools at the right time with the right ecological principles so that we're actually affecting these processes, or else cheatgrass will continue to dominate. This was our strategy. As a quick analogy, we were hoping that the perennial grasses in a short amount of time, as shown here in green, would be just taking over the site. We'd put them in and it would just start taking over the cheatgrass. That's not exactly what happened. It was more like this. Other parts of the ecosystem started to emerge. As shown here with these different colored circles, they were already in the ecosystem and they responded. Our big blue dot's still there, cheatgrass is still there, but we planted a seed of perennial grasses that we know can start changing processes over time. Other scenarios have been observed before. Sometimes people will start putting in lots of different types of perennial grasses into the system in hopes of change. But all of those in contrast to doing nothing, it's quite obvious. If we start affecting the processes, then we can start affecting the change. It's my hope that throughout today you're going to understand these principles a lot better. Each of the speakers has prepared a talk to take you through this program and understand how you can really be affecting the processes. So I'd like to just make some quick conclusions here. The EBIBM framework advocates addressing processes for annual grass persistence. And management, as you're going to see throughout today, strategies need to collectively address all these different causes of succession within an ecosystem. You can't just focus on one process. You can't. As we showed earlier, there's a lot of processes that are occurring at the same time. You got to be thinking about them. EBIPM gives us a way to think about the primary ones that you can influence. And variable outcomes are going to happen. And these strategies need to be reassessed, and you've got to keep working on your site. It's not a one-time shot. Processes don't occur in the fall that you apply treatments only. You have to keep working at those processes and understand your system better. I'd like to first of all thank many people who have been a part of this. First of all, my lab has been very supportive of this type of research, and we're very happy to be part of the area-wide program. My technician, Justin Williams, and my research leader, Jack Stout, have been very supportive of this program over the years. In addition, the NRCS and UACD in Utah have been our partners from day one. Before we even went to the field, we were talking with them about this program. And the entire Park Valley community welcomed us. This summer with the field school was an awesome opportunity to really interact with them, and we left a lasting impression on them. And the work that I presented to you today could not have even come to pass if it wasn't for two graduate students at Utah State University advised by Chris Call, Beth Bowers and Marilyn Hirsch. And they're shown in some of these photographs here. Thank you for your time, and hopefully I've